The Bridge, an MOP Godzilla crossover, written by Tarbtano on fanfiction.net. Read by Prince Lashlaw / Power Balance. Chapter 3, Impact Canterlot. Twilight clumsily flapped her wings to try and gain some distance as her jaw nearly dropped. Draped in a rainbow spectrum of light, a tall being, greater in height to the princess of the night herself, settled its hooves down on the floor. The lights dimmed, and the being's horn seemed to draw the brilliant beams of light in, like it was absorbing them. Smooth, polished chitin glimmered with radiance as the newcomer lowered her wings against her body. She smiled pleasantly at the alicorn, but Twilight was near ready to cast a concussive spell. It might have a horn and wings, but the holes-filled hooves, exoskeleton, and draping mane clearly told her that this was no alicorn. She was a changeling, and a queen at that. In the alicorn's mind, presumably a queen she knew well. The changeling nodded slowly, not at all reacting to the young alicorn's spiteful glare and her glowing horn as Twilight put herself between the intruder and the still sleeping Spike. "Please, I must have a word with you, Miss Sparkle," the changeling said in a bell-like voice. "Not today, Chrysalis!" Twilight barked out as she menacingly clicked on the spell to fire a blast that would hopefully blow the intruder into the next century. Only for two tiny voices to cut off her concentration and thought. "Her name isn't Chrysalis! She is Mothra!" Twilight instantly ceased the glowing charge of magic and looked around for the source. The voice sounded almost as if it was right next to her, yet no one was present. The changeling, apparently named Mothra, giggled as she spoke. "Laura, Moll, I think it's best that she see you before you start confusing her." Mothra ignited her horn briefly with a gentle glow, casting a brief wave that reached across the room like a bubble as her horn glowed a brilliant rainbow of hues, revealing two sparkling balls of light, one blue, one red, hovering before the bewildered Twilight. Twin tiny voices, speaking in unison, chimed out, "Hello, friend!" Twilight looked wide-eyed at the sight before her. She studied as much about magic as she possibly could. According to Celestia's word, even surpassing Star Swirl in a few categories. But never had she seen anything like this. The orbs didn't seem to be pure energy, as a faint outline of a figure was visible, if one looked hard enough. But no features at all were visible, just a vague outline. It was almost as if something wasn't fully there. That's when she finally looked the changeling monarch over once more. For one, her chitin color was all wrong for Chrysalis, being a mere pure white with a slight greenish tint, rather than the dark charcoal gray Chrysalis bore. The mane was also much more well kept, uniform manner as it was draped down, and was a light green hue. The tail was identical in condition and color. The eyes were beautiful in a strange way, even for a creature as odd as a changeling. This being, Mothra, as the orbs called her, had twin double-layered irises with emerald and sky-blue rings around the pupils. Looking to her back made the differences all too noticeable. Instead of a hole-filled, sharp, see-through fly-like wings, this changeling had a barrage of colors across a pair of butterfly-esque wings. Mothra's calm, gentle voice whispered to the alicorn, "I am known in my home realm as Mothra, guardian of Earth. This, however, is not my normal state. I apologize if I alarmed you." Twilight caught her breath and stood firm, looking up into the green and blue orbs, not quite knowing what to make of all this. She looks and sounds convincing enough. But what's all this about realms? What are these two bright talking lights? How'd she even get in here? Changelings can disguise themselves as other ponies they see. Perhaps they can make a unique design? Better safe than sorry. Twilight heard her hoof out as she spoke. There is a certain queen you resemble that's a shape-shifting mother I'd rather to have never met. I'm not the distressing type, but she caused my friends and fam calamity twice now. I am a student of magic, have, and I've since learned a spell that reveals changelings' disguises. May I use it on you so I can be sure this is your true form? The changeling nodded before replying. Of course. Anything is needed. Martha stood still and closed her eyes as Twilight's horn glimmered with energy, hoping her own trust wasn't misplaced. Miles away in Canterlot, Luna trode across the lonely halls, banishing the last pangs of tiredness from her body. Celestia had been away on business, leaving her younger sibling to manage the castle and celestial affairs. She'd gotten up some minutes ago after a nap to prepare to lower the sun and raise the moon, taking a stroll to stretch out and wake up, but not without a grumble in her stride. Celestia put up with this dual shift for a millennium? No wonder why she eats so many sweets and cake. This much stress would put some ponies into a coma. Rolling her eyes, Luna looked out into the dimming horizon. Her horn was still aching slightly from the last night. The same time Celestia and, according to a messenger scroll, Cadence had their horns act up. The latter, poor girl, was hit so harshly she passed out. The aching wasn't what disturbed her most, though. This was a case where the cause and not the effect had her attention. Luna's horn flickered through with the discomfort, the cosmos above beginning to shift into a sunset. A curtain of twilight and then night slipping over Canterlot to steadily spread over the whole of Equestria in dark, peaceful ways. 3 out of 4 alicorns with sudden pain. Add young Miss Sparkle to the ranks, and that's the whole group, with seemingly no others sharing the experience. Luna looked across the landscape, watching the distant forms of other ponies going about their business. A kind always was more in tune with the world and its changes than normal equines. If something just disrupted the realm, that could... A sudden, deep rumble shocked the palace, booming out from the east end, banishing Luna's previous thoughts. Gaining her wits, the knightly princess galloped down full speed down the hallways, bouncing off the silken red carpet and taking wing, gliding down a flight of stairs. The sounds of conflict, yelps, bangs, thumps, and hollers of guards tore through the air as Luna passed the main hall of the east end. She stopped briefly and beheld the sight. There was a massive hole, easily a dozen feet across in diameter, that had ripped through the ceiling. Scattered pieces of metal roofing, concrete, wood splinters, and all that held the castle roof and floors together were strewn all over the place. Several beaten guards lay around near the impact crater of shattered tile. The small groans gave fleeting relief that they were alive, but in need of medical condition. That's when she saw the tracks, hoof prints, massive ones that were leading out of the crater. They were set into the floor almost like they had burned them through. Passing a guard as she followed the gradually shallower and less burnt tracks, Luna noticed the armor on her flank had actually been similarly burned, so much so the golden metal on the outside was even particularly melted. A yell drew her attention, causing her out into the main hall. Racing forward, Luna ran past several panicking and bruised nobles and palace workers. A fight was still going, with half a dozen guards rushing out and dueling with absolute monster-sized stallion. Even Shieldcrash, one of the largest guards on staff, was a full head or so shorter and easily half the mass of this pony. The closer Luna got, the more it became clear this was the largest stallion she'd ever seen. So much she nearly mistook him for a horse at first. It seemed to be a unicorn, but it was fighting tooth and hoof rather than using magic, and doing a fine job at that. The coat was a charcoal gray, with a spiny patch of fur along the back that stood up lightly. The mane and tail were a dull gray and very spine-like. The tail especially, while resembling hair, resembled a spiky fin more than it did an equine tail. The cutie mark was bafflingly odd. It was a symbol of some sort, a circle right at the center, with 3 trapezoids surrounding it, with a smaller face pointing inward. Several more royal and knight guards charged in, and Luna, unable to magically blast the unruly stallion for fear of striking one of her own guard, looked on. They piled onto the odd pony, literally covering it from near head to toe in an attempt to drag it down. It almost worked. Almost being the key word. The pony's mane and tail flashed a blue light that blared out from the gaps between the guards, and a massive shockwave ripped through his body and all whom were touching him. Guards were thrown across the room like beach balls, skidding across the floor or impacting the walls before slipping into unconsciousness. The attack would have given Luna thought for pause had it been any other situation. For while it was definitely energy-based, the lack of glow from the intruder's horn and its odd sensation showed it not to be magic. The stallion stood unfazed before slowly shifting its head and looking at Luna, snorting like a mad bull with streaks of blue smoke streaming from his maw as he spoke.
Pathetic! Even against this tiny form they fall. Be glad I didn't kill them. I'm not in the best mood after being attacked for no reason. Now, if your kind would be courteous enough not to try to dogpile me on sight. Where am I?
Luna was near her temper's breaking point, her starry mane waving along the windless room as she stood atop the stairs. Her voice was a chorus of anger. You! Who do you think you are? Assaulting the Celestial Castle, attacking its staff of guards, and then have them the audacity to bark forth at a diarch? The stallion rolled his eyes, looking and talking back in a half-disgruntled manner.
I didn't start this, you witch. If that group are the elite, then your minions better not be brought against me, lest an accident happens.
Luna's eyes snapped into white flame as a bright white stream of energy ripped out from her horn, yelling out in a voice not often heard for 1,000 years. Enough! The stallion didn't have time to react before the beam slammed into him, sending him flying back and crashing into the wall. Luna canceled out her attack. Still, her face cast a stern glare as she watched the darkness, the hole in the wall her foe had crashed through provided. Red and yellow eyes briefly glared through the darkness back at her before the entire hole was gushing out in a brilliant blue and white light. Luna barely had enough time to dodge to the side, the tip of her wing feathers being slightly singed by a stream of burning heat and energy that smashed through the stained glass behind her into the skies beyond. The beam continued for a second or two before cut off like a silenced flame. The stallion slowly walked out of the gaping hole in the wall, his mane and tail still glowing as flickers of blue sparks slipped from his maw. His torso was still smoking from Luna's attack, obviously having been damaged, but the pain seemed only to add fuel to the fire. His expression was pure rage.
I am Godzilla, king of the monsters, and for these attacks, you and your kind have just managed to piss me off!
Back at Sweet Apple Acres, Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo screamed as they dove behind the wagon for cover, Destroya charging over them and only barely avoiding crushing the pair underfoot due to her long stride. The 2 standing timber wolves snarled and split up, one charging to meet her head-on while the other circled around. The charging wolf and the alicorn ran into each other, rearing up on their hind legs in a massive ball of anger and rage. Hooves bucked and branches snapped as splintered claws raked against equine hide, leaving green fluid to spill out. Destroya snarled through the pain and rammed her right hoof forward, bashing through branches, bark, and leaves, ripping out through the beast's wooden backbone. The alicorn chuckled grimly to herself as she assured a paralyzing blow, only for her face to turn to bewilderment as the wolf, unfazed by the blow, clamped its jaws down on her left forelimb. The former kaiju yelped out in pain, staggering back as the wolf's spine and torso reformed. Gritting her teeth, Destroya tried to shake her attacker off. So, I must be less durable now, and it reforms too easily to leave a lasting wound. Her thought was cut off by the wooden lupine releasing her bleeding forelimb and lunging for her neck. Sweetie Belle and Skulu looked on in horror, almost certain of what was to follow. And then Destroya remembered a certain trait about her horn, one she used against a previous foe that regenerated. The Alicorn's horn ignited with a hellfire as she swung down, leaving a red streak to fly through the air as she brought the horn down on the still lunging Timberwolf's head. The wood was no defense against the energized horn. Searing hot energy burned through it as much as it did cut through the timbers. The Timberwolf didn't have time to yelp before its head was bisected, its broken halves smoking as they fell to the ground. The body stood still for a moment before crumbling down into a heap of twigs and leaves like a castle of cards. Destroya snarled, spitting on the corpse as she heard a second series of charging footsteps behind her. The demonic being could almost giggle. She may be more vulnerable, but no less armed. And now that she wouldn't be caught by surprise by some cheap parlor trick, there was no doubt. 1-on-1, 2-on-1, or even 5-on-1. They don't stand a chance now. Spinning her around as her mane crackled with purple energy, Destroya threw open her maws. A spray of white vapor and purple steam ripped loose from her jaws and impacted the remaining Timberwolf. Its body was instantly enveloped by micro-oxygen that tore each of its cells to shreds. The corpse fell to the ground, its entire body, save for a few twigs and leaves, entirely turned into the same vapor Destroya breathed in to feed. Destroya hissed gleefully as she fled. Vaporized cells. Always a favored taste. Shifting her gaze to the last Timberwolf, who had either in a foolhardy attempt to feed or flee and hide from its comrade's killer, was clawing its way over to the wagon in its two shivering forms. Just as it dove its wooden skull into a space of the overturned wagon and a pair of screams echoed out, Destroya grabbed the beast by its hind leg and ripped it back. The wounded monster yelped, flailing about as the hits of micro-oxygen sliced through the air. The Timberwolf failed more and more as less and less of it was physically there. One last howl weakly eased out before all that was left was a pile of residue and vapor, the latter being sucked into the horned Pegasus mare's moth. Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo, still shaking with fright, poked their heads out from under the wagon as Destroya absorbed the last of her meal. She stood tall and fanned her wings to try and ease her muscles. Green liquid was leaking out of her neck, shoulder, and arms, making her already ravaged appearance even worse. However, she paid little attention as she looked down at the fillies with a devil's smile. Just as she was about to fire another blast of her signature oxygen destroyer, a jolting pain ripped out from within her. "What's wrong with me?" Gasping for breath, Destroya barely had enough time to grasp at her stomach before doubling over, unable to move and shaking violently. The last thing she saw before passing out was two fillies rushing up to join her, joined by a red-haired equine of the same age, tailed by an older mare and stallion that rushed up from a path leading from the barn. Meanwhile, back at the library, the bubble of purple magic that cloaked Mothra's bodies faded into a brilliant display as the anti-changeling spell dissipated. The royal changeling remained unchanged, and in a gleeful smile warmed over Twilight's face as she spoke. "Well, that should do it. Sorry about that, miss." Mothra nodded before walking across the room and up to the young Alicorn. "Don't be. Your suspicion was well-founded. Odd sensation this world magic has. Familiar, though," she said with a smile. At that, Twilight's eyebrow raised again. Obviously both curious and confused, her inner desire for knowledge was sparking once more. "You keep saying you're from somewhere else. Where? Is it in Equestria or somewhere different? You don't act much like a changeling." Mothra's wings fluttered as her mind raced. As knowledgeable as she was, mostly due to the inherent memories of her predecessors thanks to Infant Island's mysticism, this world was more foreign to her than anything she'd ever known. "I fear the place I call home is very, very distant. I was transported here for what I can only believe to have been some sort of bizarre accident. The transfer somehow changed my body accordingly. If the others have arrived in the same place, something simpler must have happened to them," she said in a slightly solemn tone. Twilight's eyes widened as the sparks to gather more knowledge grew into a raging flame. extraterrestrial beings? Other worlds? Foreign magic? All questions she had since foalhood were standing right before her, and there were more of her kind here? Millions of questions ripped through her mind as much as the grin that gathered upon her face. How many more are there? What spells do you know? Can they all do magic? Can you teach me any? Got any books? Mothra giggled at the teenager's glee. Seeing happiness of others always was something that she rarely got to witness back home, and it never failed to please her. This young mare seemed near ecstatic. Patience, patience, Twilight. Don't burst yourself. Before we get into detail, I must have if you have any star maps. If I recognize any patterns, I might be able to tell you exactly where I'm from. Do you have any? Twilight smirked, trotting off to the astrology section of the library with Mothra in tow. You couldn't have come to a better spot in Ponyville. Spike slept sleepily through the whole dang thing. Minutes later, at Fluttershy's cottage, Zanilla sat calmly on the hardwood floor, his horn and shoulder patches glowing as he levitated a teacup over to himself and sipped it. Fluttershy smiled as she added a pinch more sugar to her cup. While she sat down on her couch, the Pegasus swallowed her sip and tilted her head in curiosity and asked her an inquiry. So, you say there might be 6 of your friends here as well? Zanilla flinched at the hot tea as much as her words did. Against this mare he did not lie, least get that glare of hers again. Any inconvenience he could live without was well avoided. Still he could, however, bend the truth as he told a tale of his own.
Friends would be a rough term. Destroyer would be the closest ally, but yes, there are 6.
Fluttershy was put a bit on the uneasy side by that name, but continued, and I take it they'd all be just as confused as you were? Zanilla glanced over at the patched-up floor where his crystals once stood, deciding that label was best to keep things on the calm side. Likely. Fluttershy flapped her wings and hovered up, obvious concern on her face. Oh, then we must go and find them all as soon as possible. Fluttershy was cut off by the front door being bucked open by a very frantic Applejack, who spun around to rush in so fast her hat flew off and needed to be caught. Fluttershy! We need you down in the bar sign ASAP. Philly sounds a big red mare and she's hurt bad. Doc's another 30 minutes out, so you gotta come down and... Applejack stopped her sentence short as she looked up at the massive form of Zanilla standing before her, obvious surprise clad on her face. Well, howdy. Zanilla lowered down and looked at the mare on eye level.
What shade of red would you say she was?
30 minutes later, back at Canterlot Palace, a massive explosion cued a shockwave that tore through the whole palace. In the Commons Hall, the wave and rattling foundations cracked and shattered half of the windows that still stood in one piece, as 2 beings dueled in the main hallway. Luna and Godzilla had been fighting through several rooms and corridors, leaving the palace in utter disarray and wreckage in their wake. Diving under a heat ray that burned through several walls behind her, Luna flapped her wings to gain speed as she charged the stallion head-on, putting her 4 hooves foot out much like a certain superhero from another planet that connected with Godzilla's torso and yanked the kaiju unicorn off his feet, still firing off his ray from his maw, nearly missing the chance to fry the princess's neck. They continued to sail through the air until they both hit the massive wooden gate at the garden. The speed Luna was flying at and their combined mass being enough to smash through the latch into a shower of splinters and into the outside world. Arching her back, Luna kicked out with her hind legs and launched her foe away from her and into a pond. Quickly erupting out of the churned waters almost as soon as he landed, Godzilla stood up to his full height and glared at his foe that hovered about 15 feet above him. The Kaiju King cracked a small smile.
I must say, I am impressed.
Luna only sneered in response, her anger making her modern accent slip. Keepeth thy compliments in thine maw, brute. Why has he besieged our lands and populace? Godzilla snorted, glancing up at the still smoking palace. His memories after the blast on Sogyo Island were very hazy. At first he was unable to see, but could tell he had fallen somewhere. And judging from the pain he felt coursing through his body, he just landed on something very hard. Before he could even react or figure out where he was, several group of technicolored equines were charging him. He may not have been as quick to enrage as his father was, but he was never one to give up and take assault lying down, and resisted. More got involved with the fight. The building he was in was getting trashed. This large blue equine attacks him. Now we're up to the present. Both of the two were nearly to the point of huffing for breath. After fighting for nearly half an hour now, both were fairly bruised, scratched and beaten. Godzilla grumbled as he glanced his eyes down at the frosted wound on his chest, inflicted by Princess Luna's projectile assault some minutes earlier. Either the inhabitants of this world had some special quality, or his powers were changed as much as his body had. But whichever it was, he wasn't healing as quickly as he should be. Both or neither be the cause, the pain only enraged him more as he swallowed it in.
I acted in self-defense. You and your race are the aggressors here. I didn't start this battle, but I will finish it.
Godzilla's mane and tail glowed a bright white light as he snarled, just as the same as waves of bright white energy collected in the princess' horn. Streams of starry white and torrent blue flame ripped through the air at the same time, and both missed, yet also found their mark.